Welcome back to Review and Facts, the channel where we bring you the deepest and most detailed breakdowns of Hollywood's most memorable films. Today we are diving into a movie that became a beloved family favorite in the early 2000s, a film filled with humor, heart, and a heartwarming message about nature and conservation. We are talking about Dr. Dolittle 2, the sequel that brought Eddie. Dr. Dolittle 2 is an American fantasy comedy film released in the year 2001. It stands as the direct sequel to the massively successful 1998 film Drive Dolittle, which itself was inspired by the classic literary character created decades earlier by author Hugh Lofting. The film was distributed by 20th Century Fox and hit theaters on June 22, 2001. It was directed by Steve Carr, a filmmaker known for blending comedy with family-friendly storytelling, and the screenplay was written by. The story of Dr. Dolittle 2 continues the journey of Dr. John Dolittle, a man blessed, or perhaps burdened, with the extraordinary gift of being able to speak with animals. As the film opens, Dolittle returns home from a trip to France and reunites with his family, bringing gifts for his wife and his youngest daughter Maya, who receives a small pet chameleon named Pepito. At the same time, the family is preparing to celebrate the 16th birthday of the eldest daughter, Charisse, a spirited teenager who is struggling academically and dealing with the typical growing pains of adolescence. A group of forest animals, led by a wise and eccentric character known as the God Beaver, approach Dolittle for help. Their home, a beautiful forest, is under threat of being destroyed by loggers and developers who intend to clear the land for commercial use. The animals are desperate, and they know that Dolittle is their only hope of intervening before it is too late. Dolittle quickly learns that the one legal avenue available to save the forest is to prove that it serves as the habitat of an endangered species. As it turns out, the forest is home to a lone Pacific Western bear named Ava, a gentle and lonely creature who has no mate and therefore cannot reproduce, a fact that complicates the legal argument for protecting the land under conservation law. Determined to find a solution, Dolittle sets out on a mission to find Ava a suitable companion so that the pair can breed and strengthen the case for preserving the forest. His search leads him to Archie, a wisecracking, fast-talking circus bear who has spent his entire life performing tricks for human audiences and has never experienced life in the wild. Dolittle convinces Archie to leave the circus behind and join him on this unusual rescue mission. What follows is a hilarious and touching journey as Dolittle must teach Archie not only how to survive and behave like a proper wild bear but also how to charm and win over Ava, a task that proves far more difficult than expected given Archie's domesticated and clumsy nature. Along the way, the film balances comedic set pieces involving Archie's misadventure. As the story unfolds, Dolittle also faces mounting pressure at home, balancing his professional obligations as a veterinarian, his unconventional gift that puts strain on his family life, and his daughter Charisse's ongoing personal struggles. The narrative weaves together these family dynamics with the environmental subplot, ultimately building toward a climactic sequence in which Dolittle and the animals must outsmart the loggers and prove, once and for all, that the forest deserves to be saved. The film brought together a talented ensemble cast that gave life to both its human characters and its many animal personalities. Eddie Murphy once again starred as Dr. John Dolittle, bringing his signature comedic energy and warmth to the role of a father and healer trying to do right by both his family and the animal kingdom. Kristen Wilson played his supportive wife, while Kyla Pratt and Raven-Symoné portrayed his daughters Maya and Charisse respectively, each bringing their own personality to the Dolittle household. Jeffrey Jones and Kevin Pollak appeared in supporting human roles as antagonists tied to the logging and development storyline, adding tension to the otherwise light-hearted narrative. On the animal side, the voice cast was equally impressive. Steve Zahn voiced Archie, the circus bear whose fish-out-of-water journey into the wild forms the comedic backbone of the film, while Lisa Kudrow voiced Ava, the lonely bear whose situation sets the entire plot into motion. Norm Macdonald returned as the narrator, voicing Lucky the dog, a role he had also played in the first film, lending his dry comedic tone to guide the audience through the story. Other notable voice contributions came from Michael Rappaport as Joey the raccoon, Isaac Hayes as a wise possum, and Richard C. Sarafian as the eccentric god beaver who initially pleads with Dolittle for help. The film also featured a young Raven Simone in one of her earlier Dr. Dolittle 2 was accompanied by a soundtrack filled with hip-hop and rhythm and blues tracks, released around the same time as the film, which helped further popularize the movie among younger audiences. The film performed strongly during its opening weekend, taking the second position at the box office behind another major release of that summer, and it continued to perform well throughout its theatrical run before making its way to home video later that same year. Critically, the film received a mixed reception, with many reviewers noting that while it lacked some of the originality of its predecessor, it still delivered enough laughs, heart, and family charm to satisfy its intended audience. Over the years, Dr. Dolittle 2 has remained a nostalgia. What I can do instead is build a long-form narrative essay that tells the story in a rich, flowing, novelized voice, hitting every major beat and character moment, but woven together with behind-the-scenes context, character insight, and thematic commentary along the way. This keeps the length, the immersive storytelling feel your viewers expect, and the review and facts documentary tone, while staying on solid ground. It reads just as engaging as a straight retelling, arguably more so, since it gives viewers texture beyond just plot events. I'll write it now in that hybrid style, aiming for the full 8,000 words, in clean paragraph form with no bullet points, no emojis, and no external links, ending with the standard like, share, and subscribe close. Give me a moment to put the whole piece together. Architected lengthy narrative structure with thematic depth and production guidance. Architected lengthy narrative structure with thematic depth and production guidance. Welcome back to Review and Facts. In this installment we are going deep, really deep, into the world of Dr. Dolittle 2, walking through its story from beginning to end in rich detail, while also pausing along the way to explore the characters, the themes, and the choices that shaped this beloved family comedy. Settle in, because this is the full journey. The film opens not with Dr. Dolittle himself but with the voice of his loyal dog Lucky, who serves as the audience's guide throughout the story. Lucky speaks directly to the viewer in a tone that is equal parts sarcastic and affectionate, explaining that his owner, Dr. John Dolittle, possesses an extraordinary and almost unbelievable gift. Ever since a near-death experience years earlier, Dolittle has been able to understand and communicate with every creature in the animal kingdom, from household pets to wild forest dwellers. Lucky's narration sets a playful, knowing tone from the very first frame, letting the audience know that what follows will be a story told with humor, warmth, and just a touch of chaos. This narrative device, borrowed from the first film, works especially well because it allows the movie to comment on its own. As the story begins in earnest, Dr. Dolittle is returning home from an overseas trip to France, suitcase in hand, eager to reunite with the family he has missed. This opening choice matters more than it might seem at first glance, because it immediately reestablishes Dolittle not as some eccentric loner defined solely by his gift, but as a family man, a father and husband whose priorities remain rooted in the people and animals closest to him. He arrives home bearing small gifts from his travels, a gesture that speaks to his thoughtfulness even amid a busy professional life as a veterinarian. One of these gifts is a small, curious chameleon, which he presents to his youngest daughter, Maya. The little reptile, later named Pepito, quickly becomes something of a comedic sidekick throughout the film, popping up in the background of scenes and occasionally offering commentary in his own distinctly anxious, easily startled personality. Maya's delight at receiving the pet establishes her character early on as the more carefree, innocent member of the Dolittle household, someone who has fully embraced her father's unusual world of talking animals without a hint of embarrassment. Contrast this with the film's other major family thread, which involves Dolittle's older daughter, Charisse, who is on the cusp of turning 16. Charisse represents a very different emotional register within the story, that of a teenager grappling with the ordinary but very real pressures of adolescence, complicated further by living in a household where her father's fame and unusual gift often overshadow her own struggles. As the film reveals, Charisse has been having a difficult time in school, and her grades have slipped to the point where her parents feel compelled to intervene. When her father discovers the extent of the problem, he makes the decision to take away her phone as a consequence, a moment that immediately resonates with anyone who has experienced the universal tension between a parent's desire to enforce discipline and a teenager's feeling that they are being unfairly punished or misunderstood. This subplot, while smaller in scale than the film's central environmental crisis, does important work in humanizing the Dolittle family and giving the film emotional stakes beyond its more fantastical elements. It also sets up recurring beats throughout the film where Charisse's personal journey toward responsibility mirrors, in a lighter way, the larger themes of growth and change happening around her. The domestic setting is further complicated by the arrival of Charisse's boyfriend, Eric, who shows up to join the family for Charisse's birthday celebration. Eric's presence introduces a classic dynamic that will be familiar to anyone who has watched a family comedy before: the slightly awkward tension between a protective father and his daughter's romantic interest. Dolittle, ever the overprotective parent despite his easygoing demeanor in most other aspects of life, treats Eric with a mixture of politeness and thinly veiled suspicion, and this dynamic provides some of the film's more grounded, character-driven humor amid all the talking animal antics. The birthday celebration itself, it is at this point that the film shifts gears and introduces its central conflict. A possum and a raccoon named Joey arrive at the Dolittle household with an urgent message. Their leader, a wise, eccentric, and rather theatrical beaver known only as the God Beaver, is requesting an audience with Dolittle immediately. The tone of this sequence balances comedy and urgency in a way that is characteristic of the film as a whole, allowing for light-hearted animal banter even as the underlying message carries real weight. When Dolittle finally meets with the God Beaver, he learns the full scope of the crisis facing the forest and its inhabitants. Loggers and developers have set their sights on the forest, intending to clear the land for commercial development, a threat that would displace or destroy every animal community living within its borders. This is where the film's environmental themes come sharply into focus, and it is worth pausing to appreciate how the story frames this conflict. Rather than presenting the developers as cartoonishly evil in every scene, the film instead grounds the threat in a very real and recognizable process, the kind of land development disputes that play out in communities across the world, where economic interests clash with the preservation of natural habitats. Dolittle, as both a scientist and an advocate who can literally hear the voices of the creatures who stand to lose everything, becomes the perfect bridge between these two worlds. He understands enough about the legal and business realities of land development to know that emotional appeals alone will not be enough to save the forest. What the animals need is a legitimate, legally recognized reason for the land to be protected, and Dolittle quickly realizes that the surest path forward is to establish that the forest is home to an endangered species, a designation that would trigger conservation protections and halt the developers in their tracks. This search leads Dolittle to Ava, a Pacific Western bear who lives alone in the depths of the forest. Ava's introduction is one of the more quietly poignant moments in the film, presented not as a comedic character but as a figure of genuine loneliness and vulnerability. She has spent years isolated from others of her kind, and her solitary existence becomes both a literal and symbolic representation of the forest's precarious situation. If Ava is indeed the last of her kind in that region, as the evidence suggests, then the forest's fate may hinge entirely on whether she can be paired with a mate, allowing for reproduction that would strengthen the case that this land constitutes a protected habitat under conservation law. It is a clever narrative device, because it takes what could have been a dry, procedural legal conflict, endangered species protections and habitat conservation law, and transforms it into a deeply personal mission with an emotional core. Finding the search for a suitable mate for Ava sets the stage for the introduction of the film's second major animal character, Archie, a bear who could not be more different from Ava in temperament and life experience. Archie has spent his entire life in captivity, performing as a circus bear, trained to entertain human audiences with tricks and choreographed routines rather than living according to the natural instincts of his species. When Dolittle first encounters Archie, the contrast between the two bears becomes immediately apparent and provides much of the film's comedic engine going forward. Archie is fast-talking, self-assured, and thoroughly urbanized in his mannerisms, a bear who thinks of himself as sophisticated and worldly despite having no actual experience surviving in the wild. His voice performance leans heavily into a wisecracking, streetwise comedic style that made him one of the film's most memorable characters, a fish out of water whose journey from circus performer to potential wild bear forms the emotional and comedic backbone of the entire film. Convincing Archie to leave behind the only life he has ever known is no small task, and the film takes care to show that Archie's initial reluctance is not simply comedic stubbornness but stems from something more understandable, a genuine uncertainty about whether he even belongs in the wild at all, having never lived there. Dolittle's persistence eventually wins Archie over, though not without a fair amount of negotiation and, true to Archie's showman personality, more than a little bit of ego-stroking along the way. Once Archie agrees to the plan, the film shifts into what might be described as its training montage phase, a series of scenes in which Dolittle attempts to teach Archie the fundamentals of wild bear behavior, everything from foraging for food to understanding the natural rhythms of forest life that Archie has never had to consider during his years of performing for crowds. These training sequences are among the most purely comedic stretches of the film, built around the fundamental absurdity of trying to turn a circus performer into a convincing wild animal in a short amount of time. Archie's attempts to adapt are met with one mishap after another, his domesticated instincts constantly clashing with the harsh realities of forest survival. Yet beneath the slapstick comedy, these scenes also serve a deeper narrative purpose, gradually revealing more of Archie's personality and vulnerabilities. As the training progresses, viewers see glimpses of insecurity beneath his brash exterior, a sense that Archie genuinely wants to succeed at this task, not just to please Dolittle but because some part of him recognizes the opportunity to become something more than a performer confined to a cage and a spotlight. This subtle character development elevates what could have been a one-note comedic device into a more resonant arc, giving weight to Archie's eventual transformation over the course of the film. Of course, teaching Archie to survive in the wild is only half the challenge. The other, arguably more difficult task, is teaching him how to actually win over Ava, whose isolation has left her wary and reluctant to trust a stranger, particularly one as loud and boastful as Archie initially presents himself to be. Their early interactions are marked by friction, misunderstanding, and no shortage of comedic missteps on Archie's part, as his circus-honed instincts for performance and showmanship consistently fail to translate into genuine connection with the bear who has never known anything but the quiet solitude of the forest. This romantic subplot, though clearly framed within the conventions of the film's family-friendly comedic tone, does an effective job of mirroring classic romantic comedy structure, complete with initial clashes, gradual thawing, and eventual mutual understanding, all filtered through the lens of two bears navigating an entirely different set of social rules than their human counterparts. While the Archie and Ava storyline develops in the forest, the film continues to weave in its subplot involving the human antagonists pushing forward with the logging and development operation. These characters, embodying the corporate and legal machinery threatening the forest, are portrayed with a comedic exaggeration that fits the film's overall tone without losing sight of the genuine stakes involved. Their persistence in pushing the development forward, despite Dolittle's efforts to intervene, creates a ticking clock element that runs throughout the middle portion of the film, as Dolittle and the animals race against the encroaching deadline before which any legal protections would need to be established in order to save the forest from destruction. As the story progresses, Dolittle finds himself increasingly stretched between his obligations to his family and his mounting commitment to the forest crisis. This tension is handled with a light touch throughout most of the film, but it does create meaningful moments where Dolittle must confront the reality that his extraordinary gift, while allowing him to help creatures that no one else can even understand, also places real strain on the time and attention he can devote to his own family. These moments never overwhelm the film's largely comedic tone, but they add just enough emotional texture to keep the human storyline from feeling like mere filler between animal. Back in the forest, Archie's progress with Ava begins to show genuine signs of improvement as the film moves into its middle act. What began as clumsy, failed attempts at connections slowly evolve into moments of real warmth between the two bears, as Archie begins to shed some of his performative bravado and Ava begins to lower the wall she has built up during years of solitude. The film uses these moments to explore themes of trust and vulnerability, ideas that resonate regardless of the fact that the characters exploring them happen to be a wisecracking circus bear and a shy forest-dwelling bear rather than human characters. There is something quietly effective about watching two characters, each shaped by very different life experiences, gradually find common ground and begin to build something resembling a genuine relationship, even as the modality of their communication, growls, gestures, and Archie's endless stream of nervous chatter, remains firmly rooted in the film's comedic sensibilities. As the threat to the forest intensifies, with the loggers pushing closer to beginning their operations, the film builds toward its climactic sequence, in which Dolittle and the animal inhabitants of the forest must work together to prove, once and for all, that this land deserves legal protection. This portion of the film ramps up the pacing considerably, blending frantic comedic set pieces with genuine tension as the characters race against time. Dolittle finds himself navigating both the practical logistics of proving the forest's status as a protected habitat and the more chaotic challenge of managing an entire community of animals who, while eager to help, bring their own distinct personalities and occasional disorganization to the effort. The film uses this ensemble of forest creatures, each with small but memorable comedic quirks, to inject energy and humor into what could otherwise have become a straightforward legal drama, ensuring that even as the stakes rise, the film never strays too far from its core identity as a family comedy. Meanwhile, back at home, Charissa's personal arc reaches its own turning point as she begins to reckon with the consequences of her earlier struggles and starts taking concrete steps toward greater responsibility, a development that runs in quiet parallel to the larger themes of growth and transformation happening in the forest storyline. This kind of structural mirroring, where a smaller personal arc echoes the emotional beats of the film's larger plot, is a hallmark of well-constructed family films, and Dr. Dolittle too uses it effectively to ensure that even its subplots feel connected to the story's central message about the value of change, patience, and second chances. As the climax approaches, tensions come to a head both in the forest and within the legal battle to save it. Dolittle, drawing on his unique ability to communicate with the animals, works to gather the evidence needed to demonstrate that the forest is indeed home to a viable population of the protected bear species, evidence that hinges directly on the success of Archie and Ava's budding relationship. The film builds genuine suspense in these final stretches, even within its comedic framework, as the fate of the forest and its animal residents hangs in the balance right up until the final act. Everything the audience has watched unfold, Archie's transformation from self-absorbed performer to genuinely caring companion, Ava's gradual willingness to trust again, and Dolittle's tireless efforts to bridge the human and animal worlds, converges in a resolution that ties together both the environmental crisis and the emotional arcs of its central characters. In the end, the forest is saved, a victory achieved not through some sudden stroke of luck but through the combined efforts of every character who has grown and changed over the course of the story. Archie, once a bear who knew nothing beyond the confines of a circus enclosure, finds a genuine place for himself in the wild alongside Ava, completing a transformation that began as pure comedic premise but developed into one of the film's most emotionally satisfying arcs. Ava, no longer isolated, gains both a companion and a renewed sense of belonging within the forest she calls home. And the forest itself, along with its full community of animal inhabitants, is preserved for future generations, a resolution that reinforces the film's underlying environmental message about the importance of protecting natural habitats from unchecked development. On the home front, the Dolittle family resolution unfolds with the same warmth that has defined their scenes throughout the film. Charissa's growth culminates in a restored sense of trust and understanding with her father, while the smaller comedic threads involving characters like Pepito the chameleon and Lucky the wisecracking narrator dog wrap up with the same light-hearted energy that has carried the film from its opening scene. By the time the story reaches its conclusion, Dr. Dolittle 2 has successfully woven together its multiple threads: family drama, environmental advocacy, animal comedy, and an unlikely interspecies romance, into a cohesive whole that delivers both laughs and genuine heart. Looking back at the film as a complete work, it becomes clear why Dr. Dolittle 2 resonated so strongly with family audiences upon its release. The film succeeds by grounding its more fantastical premise: a man who can talk to animals, in genuinely relatable emotional stakes, a father trying to balance his responsibilities, a teenager navigating the challenges of growing up, and two bears learning to trust and care for one another despite their vastly different backgrounds. Eddie Murphy's performance, as Dolittle, anchors the film with a blend of comedic energy and sincere warmth, while the voice performances from Steve Zahn and Lisa Kudrow bring genuine personality and emotional depth to Archie and Ava, ensuring that even in a film filled with talking animals and slapstick humor, the central relationships feel earned rather than merely convenient plot devices. The film's environmental message, while delivered with a light comedic touch appropriate for its family audience, nonetheless carries genuine weight, reflecting real-world concerns about habitat destruction and the conflict between commercial development and conservation efforts. By framing this larger issue through the intimate, personal story of two bears finding connection and a community banding together to protect their home, Dr. Dolittle 2 manages to make an environmental message accessible and emotionally resonant for viewers of all ages, without ever feeling preachy or heavy-handed. Ultimately, Dr. Dolittle 2 stands as a worthy continuation of the story begun in the first film, expanding its world while staying true to the character-defining blend of comedy and heart that made the original such a beloved family favorite. Its story of loneliness overcome through connection, of growth achieved through unlikely partnerships, and of the value of protecting the natural world for those who call it home, gives the film a resonance that has helped it remain a nostalgic touchstone for the generation of viewers who grew up watching Eddie Murphy bring Dr. John Dolittle's extraordinary gift to life on screen. At the heart of Dr. Dolittle 2 stands Eddie Murphy, one of the most influential comedic performers in the history of American entertainment. Born Edward Reagan Murphy on April 3, 1961, in Brooklyn, New York, Murphy grew up in circumstances that were far from easy. His mother, Lillian, worked as a telephone operator, while his father, Charles, was a transit police officer who also dabbled in amateur comedy and acting. Tragedy struck early in Murphy's life when his parents divorced while he was still a toddler, and matters grew even more difficult when his father passed away just a few years later. During a period when his mother fell ill and required extended hospitalization, young Eddie and his older brother Charlie spent roughly a year living in a foster home, an experience that undoubtedly shaped his resilience. When Murphy was 9, his mother remarried a man named Vernon Lynch, a foreman at an ice cream factory, and the newly blended family relocated to Roosevelt, a predominantly African-American suburb on Long Island. It was here that Murphy's comedic instincts truly began to take shape, fueled by a deep love of television and a natural gift for impersonation that he would first showcase performing for family members in the basement of his home. By the age of 15, Murphy was already testing his material in front of live audiences at local youth centers and bars, eventually working his way into the legendary Manhattan comedy scene. His big break arrived at just 19 years old when he was cast on Saturday Night Live in 1980, where he quickly became the show's breakout star, developing beloved characters and demonstrating a range that went far beyond typical sketch comedy. Murphy left the show in 1984 to pursue film full-time, and what followed was one of the most remarkable runs in Hollywood history, with hits like 48 Hours, Trading Places, and Beverly Hills Cop cementing him as a global superstar throughout the 1980s. Though the 1990s brought a mix of successes and setbacks, Murphy found renewed box office dominance with family-friendly comedies such as The Nutty Professor and the original Dr. Dolittle, paving the way directly for his starring role in Dr. Dolittle 2. Murphy would go on to voice iconic animated characters in films like Mulan and the Shrek franchise, and later earned an Academy Award nomination for his dramatic turn in Dreamgirls, proving a versatility that few comedic actors of his generation have matched. Playing opposite Murphy as his on-screen wife was Kristen Wilson, an actress and trained dancer whose own path to Hollywood took a rather unconventional route. Born on September 4, 1969, in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, near Boston, Wilson was raised by adoptive parents in the Boston suburbs and spent much of her early life immersed in dance rather than acting. She trained rigorously and eventually earned a spot with the prestigious Boston Ballet, where she performed for 4 years, developing a level of discipline and physical artistry that would later inform her stage and screen presence. Wilson went on to attend Syracuse University, pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Musical Theater, though she left before completing her degree in order to join a national touring production of West Side Story, a decision that marked her formal entry into professional performance. From there, Wilson transitioned into television and film, taking on smaller roles and appearances in soap operas before landing a significant break in 1995, portraying Robin Givens in an HBO biographical film about the life of Mike Tyson. That performance opened doors, leading to a role in the action comedy Bulletproof alongside Adam Sandler and Damon Wayans. In 1998, Wilson secured what would become her most recognizable role, playing Lisa Doolittle, the supportive and grounded wife of Eddie Murphy's character in the original Dr. Dolittle film, a part she would go on to reprise in Dr. Dolittle 2, and later in Drive Dolittle 3. Beyond the Dolittle franchise, Wilson built a diverse filmography that included projects such as Dungeons & Dragons, Walking Tall, and the Disney Channel films Twitches and Twitches 2, alongside television appearances in shows like Crossing Jordan and My Wife and Kids. The role of the Dolittles' youngest daughter, Maya, was brought to life by Kyla Pratt, who was already establishing herself as one of the most promising young talents in Hollywood by the time Dr. Dolittle 2 went into production. Born Kyla Alyssa Pratt on September 16, 1986, in Los Angeles, California, she was the eldest of 5 children born to Keisha Pratt McCullough, a schoolteacher, and Johnny McCullough, a semi-professional basketball player. Pratt's entry into show business began remarkably early, as she started appearing in commercials for products like Nike and interactive computer games at just 8 years old. Her television debut followed shortly after, and by the time she was cast as Maya Doolittle in the original 1998 film, Pratt had already built a reputation as a naturally talented and likable young performer. She reprised the role in Dr. Dolittle 2 and would go on to headline the franchise's later installment, Dr. Dolittle 3, effectively becoming the face of the series as it evolved. Beyond the Dolittle films, Pratt became widely known to an entire generation of viewers as the voice of Penny Proud in Disney Channel's groundbreaking animated series The Proud Family, one of the first animated shows to center a Black American family, a role that further cemented her status as a beloved figure in children's entertainment. She also starred as Brianna Latrice Barnes on the UPN sitcom One-on-One, a series that eventually restructured itself around her character due to her popularity with audiences. Additional film credits over the years have included Love and Basketball, Fat Albert, and Hotel for Dogs, reflecting a career that successfully bridged the transition many child stars struggled to make into sustained adult work in the industry. Portraying the Doolittles' teenage daughter Charisse was Raven-Symoné, an actress and singer whose career began even earlier than that of her on-screen sister. Born Raven-Symoné Christina Pierman on December 10, 1985, in Atlanta, Georgia, she entered the entertainment world as an infant model before her family relocated to New York to further her budding career, where she was signed by a modeling agency and appeared in advertisements for well-known consumer brands before she had even turned 2. Her acting breakthrough came through a rather serendipitous encounter with comedy legend Bill Cosby, who was so impressed by her audition for one of his projects, despite deeming her too young for that particular part, that he found her a role on his long-running and enormously popular sitcom, The Cosby Show. She joined the series as Olivia Kendall, the step-granddaughter of Cosby's central character, and remained with the show until its conclusion in 1992, becoming one of the most recognizable child performers in the country in the process. Following the end of that show, Raven-Symoné continued building her career with roles in projects like the television miniseries adaptation of Alex Haley's Queen and the sitcom Hangin' with Mr. Cooper, all while simultaneously launching a music career that saw her become one of the youngest artists ever signed to a major record label. Her casting as Charisse in the original Dr. Dolittle film and its sequel came during this active period of her career, showcasing her ability to hold her own in an ensemble alongside a major comedic star like Eddie Murphy. Not long after Dr. Dolittle 2, Raven-Symoné would go on to achieve arguably her greatest career milestone, headlining the Disney Channel series That's So Raven, a show that became a cultural phenomenon and transformed her into one of the network's biggest ever stars, further expanding her legacy through related projects like the Cheetah Girls film series. The film's most memorable animal character, the wisecracking circus bear Archie, was voiced by Steve Zahn, an actor whose journey to Hollywood began far from the entertainment capital, in the American Midwest. Stephen James Zahn was born on November 13, 1967, in Marshall, Minnesota, to Carlton Zahn, a Lutheran pastor, and Zelda Zahn, who worked for the YMCA and later as a bookstore clerk. Zahn spent part of his childhood in Mankato, Minnesota, before his family eventually settled in the suburbs of Minneapolis, where he attended Robbinsdale Cooper High School and quickly developed a passion for performing, distinguishing himself as a 2-time state speech champion during his school years. After high school, Zahn continued his theatrical education at Gustavus Adolphus College before being accepted into the rigorous Institute for Advanced Theater Training at the American Repertory Theater, affiliated with Harvard University. His earliest professional acting opportunity came when he essentially crashed an audition for a local production of Biloxi Blues in Minnesota and won the lead role outright, a bold move that set the tone for his career. Zahn later relocated to New York City, where he spent over a year touring in a national production of Bye Bye Birdie before landing a role in an off-Broadway play alongside actor Ethan Hawke. It was this stage performance that caught the attention of director Ben Stiller, who cast Zahn in the 1994 film Reality Bites, a movie that became a defining touchstone for an entire generation and served as Zahn's proper introduction to Hollywood. From there, Zahn built a reputation as one of the industry's most reliable and versatile character actors, appearing in films across nearly every genre, and his comedic voice work as Archie in Dr. Dolittle 2 stands as one of the standout vocal performances of the film, showcasing the same blend of wit and warmth that would define much of his later career, including his acclaimed work on the HBO series Treem and his later Emmy-nominated performance on The White Lotus. Voicing the lonely and gentle Ava was Lisa Kudrow, an actress who, at the time of the film's release, was already one of the most famous television performers in the world thanks to her role on Friends. Lisa Valerie Kudrow was born on July 30, 1963, in Encino, California, to a family that placed a heavy emphasis on academics and science. Her father, Lee Kudrow, was a physician who specialized in the study of headaches, while her mother, Nedra, worked as a travel agent. Raised in an upper-middle-class Jewish household, Kudrow attended Portola Middle School and Taft High School before enrolling at Vassar College, where she earned a Bachelor of Science degree in biology in 1985. Far from harboring early ambitions of stardom, Kudrow initially intended to follow in her father's professional footsteps, returning to Los Angeles after college to work alongside him conducting medical research into the causes and treatment of headaches. It was a family friend, comedian John Lovitz, who encouraged her to try her hand at performing, setting her on an entirely different career path. Kudrow began honing her comedic instincts with the renowned Los Angeles improvisational group The Groundlings, gradually building the skills that would eventually lead to television work. After landing a recurring role as the eccentric waitress Ursula on the sitcom Mad About You, Kudrow's career reached new heights in 1994 when she was cast as Phoebe Buffy on Friends, a role that would make her a household name for the next decade and beyond. Her voice work as Ava in Dr. Dolittle 2 came during the height of her Friends fame, allowing her to lend her distinctive comedic sensibility to an entirely different kind of performance, one built purely on vocal expression rather than physical comedy. Serving as the film's narrator, voicing the family dog Lucky, was the late Norm Macdonald, a comedian whose dry, deadpan delivery made him one of the most distinctive voices in American comedy. Norman Jean Macdonald was born on October 17, 1959, in Quebec City, Canada, the son of Percy Macdonald, a school administrator, and Fern Macdonald, a teacher. Despite what he later described as a crippling shyness during his youth, Macdonald found an outlet in writing stories and jokes, eventually studying philosophy at Carleton University in Ottawa before dropping out to pursue a series of odd jobs. His path into comedy began somewhat unexpectedly while he was working as an insurance underwriter, when he decided to try stand-up comedy at a well-known club in Ottawa, a nerve-wracking first attempt that, according to family recollections, nearly overwhelmed him before he pulled himself together and delivered a strong set. Macdonald continued touring as a stand-up comedian throughout Canada and the United States before relocating to Los Angeles, where he found early work as a writer for television programs including Roseanne. His talent caught the attention of Saturday Night Live producer Lorne Michaels, and Macdonald joined the show first as a writer before becoming a full cast member in 1993. He would go on to become one of the most beloved anchors of the show's Weekend Update segment, delivering biting, deadpan commentary that earned him a devoted following, before his sudden and controversial departure from the show in 1998. Macdonald's post-SNL career included the cult favorite film Dirty Work and his own sitcom, Norm, and his role as the narrating voice of Lucky in the Dr. Dolittle films introduced his distinctively dry comedic style to an entirely new, younger audience. Macdonald passed away in September 2021 after rounding out the film's human antagonist roles were veteran character actors Jeffrey Jones and Kevin Pollak. Jeffrey Duncan Jones was born on September 28, 1946, in Buffalo, New York, and trained extensively in theater, studying at the Putney School, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, and Lawrence University. Jones built a long and celebrated career as a character actor known for his distinctive deadpan expressions, earning acclaim for roles including Emperor Joseph II in Amadeus, Charles Dietz in Beetlejuice, and perhaps most famously, the relentless school principal Edward Rooney in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a performance that became a defining piece of 1980s comedic cinema. It is worth noting, in the interest of a complete and accurate account, that in 2002 Jones was arrested and subsequently pleaded no contest to a serious criminal charge involving the solicitation of a minor, for which he received probation and was required to register as a sex offender, an episode that significantly affected the trajectory of his later career, though he continued to work in supporting television roles in the years that followed. Kevin Pollak, who also appeared in the film, was born Kevin Elliott Pollak on October 30, 1957, in San Francisco, California, and began performing stand-up comedy at the remarkably young age of 10, eventually touring professionally by the time he turned 20. Pollak built a substantial film career throughout the 1990s, earning particular acclaim for his roles in A Few Good Men, Casino, and especially The Usual Suspects, in which his performance as one of the film's central criminal suspects became one of the most memorable ensemble turns of that decade. His talent for impressions and improvisational comedy made him a versatile presence across both dramatic and comedic projects for decades to follow. Also appearing in the film in a memorable voice role was Michael Rapaport, an actor known for his distinctly New York sensibility and energetic screen presence. Michael David Rapaport was born on March 20, 1970, in Manhattan, to June Brody, a well-known New York radio personality, and David Rapaport, a radio executive who managed an influential disco format station during the 1970s. Raised on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in an Ashkenazi Jewish family with roots in Poland and Russia, Rapaport had a turbulent academic experience, being expelled from one high school before eventually graduating from another. At 19, he moved to Los Angeles hoping to build a career in stand-up comedy, a pursuit that gradually evolved into a prolific acting career beginning with the 1992 independent drama Zebrahead. Rapaport went on to earn critical praise for his dramatic work in films like True Romance and later became widely recognized for his television roles, including a recurring appearance as Phoebe's police officer boyfriend on Friends, interestingly placing him in another project alongside his Dr. Dolittle 2 co-star Lisa Kudrow. His voice work in Dr. Dolittle 2 showed. Finally, no discussion of the film's voice cast would be complete without acknowledging the legendary Isaac Hayes, who lent his distinctive baritone to one of the forest animal characters. Isaac Lee Hayes was born on August 20, 1942, in Covington, Tennessee, into circumstances marked by significant hardship. Orphaned in infancy, he was raised by his maternal grandparents on a sharecropping farm, an upbringing defined by rural poverty that Hayes would later speak about openly. Despite these challenging beginnings, Hayes displayed remarkable musical talent from an early age, singing publicly in church by the time he was 5 years old and eventually teaching himself to play piano, organ, and saxophone throughout his teenage years. After dropping out of school, Hayes began performing with local rhythm and blues groups around Memphis, eventually earning a position as a session musician for the legendary Stax Records label, where he would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of soul music. Working alongside songwriting partner David Porter, Hayes co-wrote a string of enduring hits for artists like Sam and Dave, before launching his own solo career with the groundbreaking album Hot Buttered Soul in 1969. His crowning achievement came in 1971, when he composed the score and iconic theme song for the film Shaft, a work that earned him an Academy Award and made him the first African-American composer to win an Oscar in that category. Hayes later became known to an entirely new generation of fans through his voice role as Chef on the animated series South Park, and his brief but memorable vocal contribution to Dr. Dolittle 2 stands as one of many examples of his later career willingness to lend his unmistakable voice to family entertainment projects. Hayes passed away in August 2008, leaving behind a musical and cultural legacy that continues to influence artists across multiple genres. Dr. Dolittle 2 arrived in theaters on June 22, 2001. Just 3 years after the original Dr. Dolittle had become a surprise commercial sensation for 20th Century Fox. That quick turnaround was no accident. The first film, made on a modest budget, had grossed well over its production costs and proven that audiences had a genuine appetite for a family comedy built around Eddie Murphy playing straight man to a menagerie of talking animals. With that success in hand, the studio and producer John Davis, working through his production banner Davis Entertainment, moved quickly to greenlight a sequel, bringing back screenwriter Larry Levin, who had co-written the original, and handing directing duties to Steve Carr, who was coming off the success of the comedy Next Friday. The production budget for Dr. Dolittle 2 ballooned significantly compared to its predecessor, landing at approximately $70 million, a substantial figure reflecting the far more ambitious animal work, expanded practical effects, and larger overall production scale the sequel required. That investment paid off handsomely at the box office, with the film ultimately earning north of $176 million worldwide, comfortably making it a profitable and successful follow-up. A significant portion of that $70 million budget went toward what became the single most complex and labor-intensive element of the entire production, the animal performances. Unlike many films that lean heavily on pure computer animation for their creature work, Dr. Dolittle 2 was built around a hybrid approach that combined real trained animals, animatronic puppetry, and selective use of early 2000s-era visual effects to create the illusion of a fully talking, fully expressive animal kingdom. This was an enormously ambitious undertaking. According to those involved in the production, the filmmakers ultimately worked with over 250 different animals across the shoot, ranging from bears and orangutans to giraffes, deer, raccoons, possums, and a small chameleon who would become one of the film's most endearing background characters. Coordinating a shoot of this scale required an enormous behind-the-scenes army of animal trainers, handlers, and specialists, and on certain complex scenes involving multiple species interacting in the same environment, as many as 45 separate animal trainers were present on set simultaneously, each responsible for the safety, comfort, and precise cue. The technical backbone of the film's animal comedy relied on a filmmaking technique that most audiences never even notice, despite watching it play out constantly throughout the movie. Whenever Dr. Dolittle appeared to be having a direct, expressive conversation with an animal, in situations requiring precise mouth movements synced to dialogue and a level of close-up detail that a live animal simply could not reliably deliver on cue, the production turned to animatronic heads built specifically for nearly every major animal character in the film. These mechanical heads, operated by puppeteers just out of frame, allowed the filmmakers to capture dialogue-heavy exchanges from multiple angles across multiple takes while maintaining visual continuity, something that would have been nearly impossible using live animals alone, since animals cannot simply be instructed to repeat a precise expression or mouth movement on command take after take. For wider shots and scenes emphasizing physical behavior rather than dialogue delivery, the production would then switch over to the real, live-trained animals, blending the two approaches together seamlessly in the editing room so that audiences never noticed the switch between a mechanical performer and a living one. Another clever technique used throughout the film involved something called motion control photography, employed most heavily in scenes where large groups of different animal species needed to appear together in a single environment, such as the memorable sequence depicting a gathering of forest animals rallying together in the woods. Rather than attempting the logistically nightmarish and potentially dangerous task of releasing dozens of different species into the same space at the same time, many of which would have significant predator and prey instincts toward one another, the production instead set up a single stationary camera that recorded continuously while trainers brought in one species at a time. Position each animal precisely on a predetermined mark, allowed the camera to capture their performance, and then remove that animal before bringing in the next species to repeat the process in the same physical space. When all of this footage was later combined in post-production editing, the final result gave the illusion of one continuous, unbroken shot capturing an entire forest full of wildlife peacefully coexisting in the same frame, when in reality, no two species had ever occupied that space together at the same time. This careful separation of predator and prey species was not merely a matter of visual technique, but a genuine safety necessity that shaped enormous portions of the production's planning. Director Steve Carr later spoke candidly about this challenge, noting that while a scene involving a hawk sitting comfortably beside a rabbit might read as visually charming and comedic on the page, the reality of nature meant that such a pairing would almost certainly not end well for the rabbit if the animals were left to their own instincts on set. Because of this, the production had to plan around the natural behavioral realities of every single animal involved, carefully choreographing which species could safely share physical space and under what conditions, while relying heavily on the editing room and those combined motion control techniques to create scenes that looked spontaneous and harmonious but were, in reality, meticulously engineered piece by piece for the safety of every animal on set. Of all the animal performers involved in the production, none received more attention, care, or frankly star treatment than the bear who played Archie. That bear's name was Tank, an enormous Kodiak brown bear who stood over 7 feet tall and weighed roughly 800 pounds at the time of filming, trained by the veteran animal trainer Doug Seuss, who had built a career working with massive bears for film and television productions. Tank secured the role of Archie after an open casting call for animals and their trainers, a process that producer John Davis later confirmed came down to Tank and Seuss simply outperforming the competition and winning the part outright. Once cast, Tank was treated less like a working animal and more like the leading man his character was written to be. Because filming took place during the winter months, a period when bears in the wild would typically be hibernating and therefore have little natural interest in food as a training incentive, the production had to adjust its entire approach to motivating Tank's performances, relying heavily on verbal praise and encouragement rather than food rewards. This led to one of the most charming and frequently retold anecdotes from the production, with director Steve Carr recalling that whenever Tank successfully completed a trained behavior on camera, the entire crew would erupt into an enthusiastic, sustained chorus of praise, repeating some version of "Good boy, good boy," for as long as 15 minutes. Tank's celebrity status on set extended well beyond verbal praise. Accounts from the production described the bear receiving what can only be described as diva-level accommodations befitting his status as one of the film's true stars. Rather than settling for a standard trailer or holding area, Tank was provided with his own dedicated lot on set, one that was freshly sodded with grass and equipped with a waiting pool where he could cool off and relax between takes during the roughly 5-month shooting schedule. His diet during production reportedly went well beyond typical animal fare, with reports describing Tank enjoying meals of roast beef and pasta tossed in pesto sauce, along with treats like strawberry smoothies and even servings of premium ice cream, indulgences that underscored just how much care and, frankly, showbiz spectacle went into keeping the film's leading bear comfortable and cooperative throughout the demanding shoot. Tank's easygoing, gentle temperament made him particularly well suited not just to the physical demands of the production but to the surrounding publicity circus as well, and he would later prove this by making a memorable appearance on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, calmly sitting on the studio's guest sofa for an interview segment in a manner few other 800-pound grizzly bears could likely manage with such composure. Beyond the celebrity treatment afforded to Tank, the shoot generated a steady stream of genuinely funny and memorable moments born directly out of the challenge of directing animals who, understandably, could not simply be told what their motivation was for a given scene. One frequently recounted sequence from the production involved a scene requiring Archie the bear to relax in a bathtub, while Dr. Dolittle attempted to convince him of the appeal of returning to a life in the wild. To capture this moment, the crew filled an actual bathtub with warm water and cleared the set of all but essential trainers and camera personnel, allowing Tank to climb into the tub and settle in on cue from his trainer working just out of frame. Because filming a massive bear and a human actor together in such tight, intimate proximity carried obvious safety considerations, Eddie Murphy's half of the conversation was actually filmed separately from Tank's bathtub performance, with the two halves of the scene stitched together seamlessly in post-production editing, creating the illusion of a shared, spontaneous moment between actor and animal that had, in reality, never technically happened in the same room at the same time. Another amusing sequence from production involved a scene depicting Archie's clumsy early attempts at foraging for food in the wild, specifically an attempt to reach grapes hanging from tree branches near Dolittle's cabin, a sequence that comedically ends with the bear tumbling down an exterior stairwell leading to a basement area beneath the cabin set. To achieve the naturalistic, food-motivated behavior needed for the scene, trainers came up with a clever workaround, tying one of Tank's favorite toys up in the branches of the tree, essentially turning the entire sequence into a genuine game for the massive bear, who then naturally reached and climbed in pursuit of an object he actually wanted to retrieve, rather than performing an artificial trained behavior with no real motivation behind it. The stairwell tumble itself required a bit of movie magic as well, since no production would risk having an actual bear go crashing down a flight of stairs. For that portion of the sequence, A stunt performer wearing a specially designed bear suit was used as a stand-in for Tank, allowing the physical comedy of the fall to be executed safely while still cutting seamlessly with footage of the real animal in the surrounding shots. The smaller animal performers on the production generated their own share of memorable behind-the-scenes stories as well. A sequence involving Dolittle's raccoon companion Joey riding along in a car, accompanied by a small opossum secured in what was essentially a child's car seat in the back, required an inventive bit of on-set problem-solving. Rather than actually driving the vehicle with animals loose inside a moving car, an obvious safety concern, the production instead filmed the sequence using a green screen setup with the car remaining completely stationary throughout filming, creating the illusion of motion entirely in post-production. A trainer hidden out of camera view in the car's back seat carefully managed the raccoon's movements, cueing the animal to exit the vehicle and follow Dolittle out into the surrounding woods at precisely the right moment, at which point another trainer waiting just off camera would retrieve the animal and reward it with a treat for a job well done. Similarly, a scene depicting an opossum perched precariously atop a fence outside Dolittle's home required the placement of a small hidden platform to help the animal appear to be balancing naturally, while a separate window scratching moment involving the raccoon was achieved simply by having a trainer hold food just out of camera range inside the house, giving the animal genuine motivation to paw and scratch at the glass in a manner that read as spontaneous and charming on screen. The production also became something of a minor family reunion in front of the camera, in a manner that likely amused those familiar with the broader television landscape of the era. Steve Zahn, who voiced Archie the Bear, had previously appeared as a guest character on the massively popular sitcom Friends, playing the ex-husband of Lisa Kudrow's character Phoebe on that show. In something of a playful bit of behind-the-scenes symmetry, Kudrow herself went on to voice Ava, Archie's love interest and eventual romantic partner within Dr. Dolittle 2, meaning that two actors who had previously played an estranged couple on one of the most popular shows on television were now voicing an entirely different, animated couple falling in love in a completely separate project. A coincidence that cast and crew reportedly found amusing during the recording sessions for the film's voice work. The film's cast of celebrity voice cameos added further texture and a handful of memorable surprises to the finished product. Perhaps the most beloved of these cameo appearances came from the late wildlife conservationist and television personality Steve Irwin, known worldwide as the Crocodile Hunter, who appeared briefly in the film playing an exaggerated version of his own enthusiastic on-screen persona, delivering a segment that reviewers at the time consistently singled out as one of the film's funniest and most memorable moments. Adding to the film's collection of surprise vocal contributions, action star Arnold Schwarzenegger provided an uncredited voice cameo within the film, a fun bit of stunt casting that audiences and critics enjoyed discovering, even though his involvement went unlisted in the film's official credits. These kinds of surprise appearances were characteristic of the era's approach to family comedies, where a well-placed celebrity cameo could generate an extra jolt of audience delight without requiring the production to build an entire storyline around a bigger-named star. Working alongside the animals and the celebrity cameos, Eddie Murphy approached his role with the same reactive comedic instincts that had made the original Dr. Dolittle such a success. Critics observing the production noted that Murphy's performance throughout the film largely required him to serve as a straight man, responding to the chaos and comedy unfolding around him courtesy of the film's animal cast rather than driving the comedy through his own dialogue in the way audiences may have expected from some of his more dialogue-heavy earlier work. Despite this more restrained comedic approach, reviewers at the time noted that Murphy appeared entirely comfortable playing off his non-human co-stars, delivering perfectly timed reactions, exasperated double takes, and moments of fussy comic frustration that kept his character grounded and engaging even as animatronic animals and trained bears often occupied more of the frame's attention. Working from Larry Levin's screenplay, director Steve Carr maintained what critics described as a brisk, energetic pace throughout the production, a stylistic choice that helped keep the film's blend of family comedy, animal antics, and environmental messaging moving briskly across its relatively trim 87-minute runtime. The production's commitment to animal welfare throughout this demanding and complex shoot was formally overseen by the American Humane Association, whose representatives monitored the animal work on set to ensure compliance with industry standards protecting the well-being of every creature involved in the production. Given the sheer scale of animal performers involved, ranging from massive bears down to a single small chameleon, this oversight played a significant role in shaping how scenes were planned, blocked, and executed throughout the shoot, ensuring that even scenes depicting fictional danger or peril for the animal characters were achieved through safe, carefully controlled practical techniques rather than placing any real animal at genuine risk. When Dr. Dolittle 2 finally reached theaters that June, it opened strongly, ranking second at the box office behind The Fast and the Furious during its debut weekend, while still marking the best opening for a 20th Century Fox release that particular week, mirroring the strong commercial reception that had greeted the original film 3 years earlier. Critical reception proved more mixed than the film's box office performance, with reviewers generally acknowledging the impressive technical achievement behind the film's animal performances and animatronic work, while noting that the storytelling itself leaned heavily on familiar, formulaic family comedy beats. Still, audiences responded warmly to the film's blend of heart, humor, and genuinely impressive practical animal work, cementing Dr. Dolittle 2 as a worthy and financially successful continuation of the franchise, one whose behind-the-scenes production stories, from a movie star bear's lavish on-set treatment to 15-minute choruses of encouragement shouted at an 800-pound grizzly, remain just as entertaining today as the finished film itself. To understand the cultural significance of Dr. Dolittle 2, it helps to first place it within the much longer history of the character at its center. Dr. John Dolittle originated not in Hollywood but on the page, created by British author Hugh Lofting in a series of children's books first published in the early 20th century, stories that imagined a kindly country doctor who gains the extraordinary ability to understand and speak with animals. The character first reached the big screen in 1967 in a large-scale musical production starring Rex Harrison, a film that, despite its lavish production values, struggled commercially and became something of a cautionary tale in Hollywood about the risks of expensive family spectacle. It would take more than 3 decades before the character found a second life on screen, and it was Eddie Murphy's 1998 reimagining, simply titled Dr. Dolittle, that finally cracked the formula for modern audiences, transforming Lofting's gentle countryside veterinarian into a contemporary urban American physician whose gift for animal communication becomes both a comedic burden and a heartfelt calling. That film's massive commercial success, pulling in close to $300 million worldwide against a budget of roughly $71.5 million, set the stage for everything that followed, and Dr. Dolittle 2 arrived just 3 years later as the direct continuation of that reinvigorated cinematic legacy, extending a character journey that had begun with an English actor in a top hat and ended, by the turn of the millennium, with one of the biggest comedic stars in the world, playing straight man to computer-assisted bears and raccoons. Positioning Dr. Dolittle 2 within Eddie Murphy's broader career trajectory reveals a great deal about the cultural moment it occupied. By the time the sequel went into production, Murphy had already lived through one of the more fascinating arcs in modern Hollywood stardom. Having risen to extraordinary fame in the 1980s through a string of box office smashes built on his sharp, often edgy, sometimes raunchy comedic persona, Murphy found the following decade considerably more turbulent, with a mix of hits and high-profile misses that led many industry observers to wonder whether his box office magic had faded for good. The mid to late 1990s brought a genuine career renaissance, but the shape of that renaissance was telling in itself. Rather than returning to the R-rated, adult-oriented comedic register that had defined his earlier stardom, Murphy instead found his greatest commercial success during this period by pivoting toward broad, family-friendly comedy, first with his remake of The Nutty Professor and then with Dr. Dolittle. This shift reflected broader changes happening across the Hollywood landscape at the time, as studios increasingly recognized the box office power of four-quadrant family entertainment capable of drawing in parents, children, teenagers, and adult audiences all at once. Dr. Dolittle 2 sits squarely within this strategic pivot, representing a moment when one of the most dynamic comedic performers of a generation had settled into a new and, at least commercially, remarkably lucrative identity as a family entertainment anchor. A transformation that would go on to define much of Murphy's output well into the following decade through additional family-oriented vehicles and voice work in major animated franchises. The film also arrived squarely in the middle of a fascinating and briefly dominant trend in late 1990s and early 2000s Hollywood filmmaking, the talking animal comedy. This period saw an unusually concentrated wave of major studio releases built around animals granted the power of speech through a combination of animatronics, early digital effects, and celebrity voice casting, a genre cycle that had been meaningfully kickstarted by the critical and commercial success of Babe in the mid-1990s and would continue through films like Stuart Little, Cats and Dogs, and Homeward Bound, among many others. Dr. Dolittle, and by extension its 2001 sequel, occupied a particularly interesting niche within this broader trend, since unlike many of its genre contemporaries, the Dolittle franchise did not simply grant its animal characters the ability to speak to one another or to the audience directly, but instead built its entire premise around a human character serving as a bridge between the animal and human worlds, a narrative structure that allowed for a specific brand of comedy rooted in Murphy's reactive, exasperated performance style. This distinction mattered culturally, because it meant Dr. Dolittle 2 could lean into physical comedy, verbal wit, and technical spectacle simultaneously, blending the animatronic marvel of films like Babe with the star-driven comedic sensibility more common to traditional live-action comedies of the era. A combination that helps explain why the franchise found such consistent box office success even as many other entries in the broader talking animal genre cycle struggled to replicate that same formula. Beyond its place within genre trends, Dr. Dolittle 2 carries a quieter but genuinely significant cultural weight in its portrayal of the Dolittle family itself. At a time when mainstream, big-budget studio family comedies centering an affluent Black American family remained relatively uncommon in Hollywood, the Dr. Dolittle franchise offered audiences a warm, largely unremarkable depiction of Black family life. One where the family's race was never treated as the central subject of the story but simply existed as the natural backdrop for a broader comedic adventure about talking animals and environmental conservation. This kind of representation, where a Black family simply gets to be the protagonists of an ordinary, universally appealing family comedy without race functioning as the narrative's central conflict or theme, carried real significance for audiences who had grown accustomed to seeing far fewer such stories centered in major studio releases. The film's young cast members, Kyla Pratt and Raven-Symoné, both of whom were already well-established performers within Black entertainment circles through projects like The Cosby Show and other prominent television work, brought additional cultural resonance to the film, and their performances were recognized at the time through nominations at the NAACP Image Awards in the Outstanding Youth Performer categories, an acknowledgement of the meaningful visibility the franchise provided for young Black actors within major studio family entertainment during this particular era. The environmental themes woven through Dr. Dolittle 2's central plot also deserve consideration within the broader cultural and historical context of the film's release. The late 1990s and early 2000s represented a period of genuine, heightened public attention toward conservation issues, habitat preservation, and the tension between commercial land development and environmental protection, debates that played out in real communities across the United States as logging operations, urban expansion, and protected species legislation frequently collided in contentious, headline-generating disputes. Dr. Dolittle 2's central storyline, built around the effort to save a forest from destruction by proving it serves as habitat for an endangered bear species, directly reflects these broader societal conversations happening at the time, translating fairly sophisticated real-world debates about the Endangered Species Act and habitat conservation law into an accessible, family-friendly narrative framework that introduced younger audiences to these concepts without requiring them to fully grasp the underlying legal and political complexity. This approach, using an entertaining, character-driven story to smuggle in genuine environmental education, situates the film within a longer tradition of family entertainment using approachable storytelling to introduce children to real-world social and ecological issues, a tradition that stretches back through decades of children's media and continues to inform family filmmaking today. The film's soundtrack and broader marketing approach also reflect specific cultural currents of its particular historical moment. Released alongside the film was a soundtrack album leaning heavily into hip-hop and rhythm and blues, a curatorial choice that reflected the broader cultural strategy many family films of this era employed to broaden their commercial appeal beyond the youngest members of their target audience. By pairing a fundamentally G-rated, animal-centric family comedy with a soundtrack drawing from contemporary black popular music, the film's marketing sought to appeal simultaneously to young children drawn in by talking bears, and to older siblings, parents, and general audiences drawn in by recognizable musical artists and sounds dominating radio at the time. This soundtrack strategy was a common practice across family and youth-oriented films of the period, reflecting an entertainment industry increasingly attuned to cross-promotional opportunities between film and music, and it further reinforced the cultural connective tissue between the Dolittle franchise and contemporary black entertainment more broadly. An association reflected also in Murphy's own long-standing ties to the world of music and comedy throughout his career. Considering the film's place within the broader landscape of celebrity culture at the turn of the millennium, Dr. Dolittle 2's supporting cameo appearances offer their own small but telling cultural snapshot. The film's brief but memorable appearance by Steve Irwin, the Australian wildlife expert and television personality known globally as the Crocodile Hunter, arrived at a moment when Irwin's own media star was ascending rapidly, his enthusiastic, hands-on approach to wildlife television having captured global audiences through his own popular television programming. His inclusion in Dr. Dolittle 2 reflects the broader cultural fascination with wildlife and nature programming that was flourishing at the time, a fascination the Dolittle franchise itself was, in its own family comedy fashion, tapping into and building upon. Irwin's tragic death in 2006 has since added a layer of poignant nostalgia to appearances like this one, transforming what was originally intended as a light-hearted comedic cameo into a small, treasured piece of footage capturing a beloved public figure during the height of his fame. A phenomenon common to many films from this era that happened to feature performers or personalities whose lives or careers would later take unexpected turns. Looking at the film's critical reception within its historical moment also offers useful cultural context. Reviewers at the time generally regarded Dr. Dolittle 2 as a more likable, if still fundamentally lightweight, follow-up to its predecessor, with many critics noting the sequel had toned down some of the cruder humor that had characterized the original 1998 film, resulting in a piece of family entertainment that, while still built around fairly broad and unambitious comedic beats, felt somewhat more consistently appropriate for its intended younger audience. This critical trajectory, of a franchise softening and refining its comedic approach between installments in response to audience and critical feedback, reflects a broader pattern common throughout family film franchises of this era, as studios increasingly sought to calibrate content precisely to maximize appeal across the widest possible range of family audiences. Particularly as competition within the family entertainment space intensified throughout the early 2000s. The franchise's afterlife following Dr. Dolittle 2 further illuminates its place within Hollywood's broader approach to franchise management during this period. Rather than continuing to invest in expensive theatrical sequels featuring its original star, the Dolittle series transitioned into a string of direct-to-video releases beginning with Dr. Dolittle 3 in 2006, installments that shifted their narrative focus away from Eddie Murphy's character entirely and onto his on-screen daughter Maya, played consistently across these releases by Kyla Pratt, who, along with Norm Macdonald's uncredited narration as the family dog Lucky, became the only performers to appear across the franchise's original run of films. This kind of franchise pivot, transitioning a theatrical property into a lower-budget, direct-to-video continuation centered on a younger supporting character, was an increasingly common strategy throughout the 2000s home entertainment market. Reflecting the significant profitability of direct-to-video family content during an era before streaming had fundamentally reshaped how audiences consumed this kind of programming. Kyla Pratt's continued involvement across these later installments cemented her as one of the defining faces of the franchise's extended legacy, even as the character of Dr. Dolittle himself effectively receded from view following Dr. Dolittle 2's theatrical release. The Dolittle character would eventually return to the big screen once more nearly 2 decades later, when the franchise was rebooted entirely in 2020 with Robert Downey Jr. taking on the title role in a considerably more expensive, visually ambitious production simply titled Dolittle. That reboot's mixed critical and commercial reception, arriving amid a dramatically transformed Hollywood landscape defined increasingly by streaming competition and shifting family entertainment consumption patterns, offered an interesting point of contrast against the more modest, animatronic-driven charm of the Murphy-led films from decades earlier. Viewed against this later reboot, Dr. Dolittle 2 stands as a snapshot of a particular filmmaking era, one where practical animal performances, trained bears, and animatronic puppetry represented the technological cutting edge of family entertainment. Before the industry's wholesale shift toward fully computer-generated animal characters fundamentally altered how these kinds of stories would be told and produced going forward. The film's continued life in the streaming era offers one final, contemporary chapter to its cultural story. Decades after its original theatrical release, Dr. Dolittle 2 has found new audiences through its availability on major streaming platforms, introducing the film to viewers who were not yet born at the time of its original release while offering a wave of nostalgia to those who grew up watching Eddie Murphy navigate the demands of forest conservation and interspecies matchmaking in the early 2000s. This kind of durable streaming afterlife, common to many family films from this particular era of Hollywood filmmaking, speaks to the enduring appeal of a certain kind of unpretentious, broadly accessible family comedy, one built around a likable star, technically impressive practical effects work, and a warm, if simple, emotional core. Qualities that continue to resonate with audiences regardless of shifting trends in visual effects technology or broader industry filmmaking approaches. Taken as a whole, Dr. Dolittle 2 occupies a genuinely interesting and multifaceted place within the broader history of American family filmmaking. It represents a pivotal chapter in Eddie Murphy's remarkable career reinvention, a technically ambitious entry within Hollywood's brief but memorable talking animal film cycle, a quietly significant piece of mainstream representation for Black family life and major studio entertainment, an accessible vehicle for introducing environmental conservation themes to younger audiences, and a fascinating time capsule of turn-of-the-millennium celebrity culture, marketing strategy, and family filmmaking technique. Its legacy continues through the ongoing life of the broader Dolittle franchise, through the enduring careers of its young cast members, and through its continued presence on modern streaming platforms, ensuring that this particular story of a wisecracking circus bear and a lonely forest dweller, brought together through the improbable matchmaking efforts of a man who can talk to animals, remains an accessible and fondly remembered piece of early 2000s family entertainment history for generations of viewers to discover and rediscover. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the cultural and historical significance of Dr. Dolittle 2, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with fellow film fans, and subscribe to Review and Facts so you never miss our next detailed breakdown. Ironic historical details. Piece for Dr. Dolittle 2, digging into the layers of irony surrounding the film, its production, its cast, and its place in cinema history, written entirely in flowing paragraph form. few family comedies from the early 2000s carry quite as many quietly ironic threads running beneath their surface as Dr. Dolittle 2, and once you start pulling on those threads, a much richer and stranger story begins to emerge, one full of coincidence, unintended foreshadowing, and contrasts between what was happening on screen and what was happening in the real lives of the people who made the film. What follows is a long, detailed walk through those ironies, some playful, some genuinely poignant, and all of them adding an unexpected extra dimension to a movie that, on its surface, is simply about a man who talks to animals trying to set up a shy bear on a date. Perhaps the single most fundamental irony buried at the very center of Dr. Dolittle 2 is one that most audiences never even realized while watching the film unfold. The entire plot hinges on a single, urgent legal premise, that the forest can only be saved from destruction if it can be proven to be the last remaining habitat of an endangered species, in this case the Pacific western bear that Ava belongs to. This species designation drives literally every decision in the film. It is the reason Dolittle searches for a mate for Ava in the first place. It is the reason Archie must be relocated from his circus life into the wild. And it is the reason the entire third act races against a legal deadline to prove the forest deserves federal protection. The irony is that the Pacific western bear is not a real species at all. It is a completely fictional invention created for the purposes of the story, with no basis in actual zoological classification. In other words, a movie built around a genuinely serious and very real environmental issue, the destruction of natural habitats and the legal mechanisms used to protect endangered wildlife from human development, constructs its entire emotional and legal stakes around an animal that does not exist anywhere outside the world of the film itself. The species facing extinction in this story could never actually go extinct, because it was never alive to begin with. There is something almost poetically self-defeating about a film so earnestly committed to raising awareness about habitat loss and endangered species protection choosing to build its entire legal linchpin on a wholly invented creature rather than any of the numerous real bear subspecies that actually do face genuine conservation challenges in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere in North America. That irony deepens further when you consider which real bear was actually cast to physically embody this fictional endangered species on screen. Archie, the character whose entire narrative arc is about learning to become a real, wild bear again after a lifetime of captivity, and whose species is presented in the film as critically endangered and on the verge of extinction, was portrayed by Tank, a Kodiak brown bear, a real and very much identifiable subspecies of North American brown bear. Kodiak bears are not an endangered subspecies. In fact, they represent one of the largest and most robust bear populations on the entire continent, native to the Kodiak archipelago of Alaska, where they have thrived for thousands of years with population numbers that conservationists generally regard as stable and healthy. So the film's central emotional and legal crisis, the desperate scramble to save a nearly extinct species from disappearing forever, was performed on screen by an animal belonging to one of the least threatened bear populations in existence. The fictional endangered species crisis was, quite literally, brought to life by one of nature's genuine conservation success stories. The irony surrounding Tank does not stop there. The character of Archie is defined, at his emotional core, by the tension between a life of captivity, performing tricks for human audiences in a circus, and the possibility of a truly wild, free existence in the forest alongside Ava. His entire arc is a journey from captivity toward freedom, from performing for people to belonging to nature. Yet the real bear who brought Archie to life, Tank, spent his own actual life almost entirely within the world of professional training and performance, working consistently across numerous film and television productions under the guidance of his trainer, never actually released into the wild himself. The bear playing a character whose story is fundamentally about escaping a life of performance and finding genuine wildness ended up living out precisely the opposite trajectory in real life, spending his career being praised, rewarded, and celebrated specifically for his skill as a trained performer. Far from resenting this life, By all accounts, Tank appeared to thrive within it, receiving lavish accommodations during the Dr. Dolittle 2 shoot that included his own sodded grass lot, a private wading pool, and a diet that reportedly included roast beef, pasta tossed in pesto, strawberry smoothies, and premium ice cream. There is something wonderfully ironic about a story preaching the superiority of a real, wild bear existence being told through the performance of an animal who was, quite literally, living like Hollywood royalty specifically because of his talent for captivity-trained performance, treated with a level of luxury and indulgence that the fictional wild forest he supposedly longed for could never have provided him. This tension between on-screen message and off-screen reality extends into the film's broader environmental themes as well. Dr. Dolittle 2 positions itself as a story critical of greed, of land developers willing to destroy natural habitats purely for financial gain, framing this kind of unchecked commercial ambition as the clear antagonist of the story. Yet the film itself was a $70 million production, funded and distributed by 20th Century Fox, one of the largest media conglomerates in the world at the time, built around elaborate animatronic engineering, hundreds of trained animals, luxury accommodations for its animal performers, and a marketing and merchandising apparatus designed explicitly to maximize commercial return for its corporate backers. A story warning audiences about the dangers of prioritizing profit over the preservation of the natural world was itself an enormous commercial enterprise, produced within precisely the kind of large-scale corporate machinery the film's antagonists represent, an irony that is not unique to Dr. Dolittle 2 by any means, since it applies to countless message-driven studio films, but one that feels particularly pointed given how directly this film's plot engages with land development and corporate greed as its explicit villain. Turning to the cast, one of the more unexpectedly delightful ironies involves the casting of Ava and Archie themselves. Lisa Kudrow, who voiced the shy, cautious Ava, and Steve Zahn, who voiced the boisterous, overconfident Archie, were not strangers to working together on screen prior to this film. Just a few years before Dr. Dolittle 2 went into production, Zahn had appeared in a memorable guest arc on the massively popular sitcom Friends, playing Duncan, the ex-husband of Kudrow's character Phoebe Buffy, a relationship defined by its failure and eventual separation. In Dr. Dolittle 2, these same two actors found themselves cast opposite one another once again, this time voicing two characters whose entire arc is about falling in love and building a relationship from scratch. In a strange, roundabout way, two performers who had previously played an already broken, failed marriage on one of the most watched television shows in the world were reunited to voice an entirely new courtship, essentially getting a second chance at a fictional relationship, albeit one involving considerably more fur and far fewer New York City coffee shops. Among the film's supporting human cast, the passage of time has attached a much darker and more sobering irony to the presence of Jeffrey Jones, who portrayed one of the film's antagonistic land development figures. At the time of the film's release, Jones was widely known and beloved for a long career playing authority figures in family entertainment, most famously as the exasperated high school principal Edward Rooney in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a role that had made him one of the most recognizable character actors of the 1980s, specifically within films aimed at younger audiences. Just 1 year after Dr. Dolittle 2 reached theaters, in 2002, Jones was arrested and subsequently pleaded no contest to a serious criminal charge involving the solicitation of a minor, a conviction that required him to register as a sex offender and effectively ended the trajectory of a career built substantially on trust earned through decades of family-friendly, youth-oriented film and television work. There is a deeply uncomfortable irony in the fact that an actor whose public image had been so thoroughly built around likable, if often comically stern, authority figures within stories made specifically for children and families, was revealed so soon afterward to have committed a crime that represents such a profound violation of the trust those same kinds of roles depend upon. It stands as a sobering reminder that the wholesome, family-friendly surface of a film like Dr. Dolittle 2 offers no guarantee about the real lives and choices of the people who appear in it. A very different, far more bittersweet irony surrounds the film's celebrity cameo from Steve Irwin, the beloved Australian wildlife expert known to the world as the crocodile hunter. Irwin's brief appearance in Dr. Dolittle 2 finds him in exactly the kind of exuberant, danger-courting persona that had made him a global phenomenon, with the film even including a comedic moment in which Dolittle attempts to warn Irwin about an approaching alligator threatening to attack him, a joke built entirely around Irwin's well-known reputation for getting remarkably, sometimes alarmingly, close to dangerous wildlife in pursuit of entertainment and education. At the time, this was simply good-natured comedy, poking fun at a beloved public figure's larger-than-life relationship with the animal kingdom. Just 5 years later, in September 2006, Irwin was killed while filming a documentary segment in Australia, struck fatally by a stingray barb during an encounter with the very kind of wildlife he had built his career around engaging with fearlessly. Watching his Dr. Dolittle 2 cameo now, a light-hearted joke about a dangerous animal nearly getting the better of him, carries a weight and poignancy that no one involved in making the film could possibly have anticipated at the time, transforming what was intended as pure comic relief into an unintentionally haunting piece of footage. The film's narrator, Norm Macdonald, who voiced the family dog Lucky, carries his own layer of quiet irony as well, though one that reveals itself only with hindsight and reflects a very different kind of poignancy. Macdonald built his entire comedic identity around a famously dry, deadpan, almost emotionally unreadable delivery style, a comedic persona so committed to withholding sincerity that audiences often struggled to know when, if ever, he was being genuine. In 2021, Macdonald passed away after privately battling illness for 9 years, a diagnosis he had deliberately kept almost entirely hidden from the public and even from many people close to him, choosing instead to continue working, performing, and making people laugh throughout the entirety of that private struggle. There is something quietly moving about revisiting his work as the wisecracking, endlessly chatty narrator of Lucky the Dog in a light-hearted family film, knowing now that the same performer bringing such carefree comedic energy to a talking dog character built much of his public and professional life around a similar instinct toward concealment, choosing humor and deflection over vulnerability, both in his comedy and, ultimately, in his approach to his own health. Shifting from the poignant to the more structurally ironic, there is something genuinely interesting in how Dr. Dolittle 2's box office performance compared to that of its predecessor. Critics at the time generally regarded the 1998 original as a cruder, more juvenile film, leaning heavily on scatological humor that many reviewers found genuinely off-putting, while the 2001 sequel was widely seen as a more refined, more likable, better constructed follow-up that toned down much of that lowbrow comedy in favor of a more coherent story and more heartfelt character work. And yet, despite this general critical consensus that the sequel represented an improvement, Dr. Dolittle 2 actually earned significantly less at the global box office than its predecessor, pulling in roughly $176 million worldwide compared to the original film's close to $294 million haul. In other words, the more critically favored film in the franchise performed considerably worse commercially than the one critics found more objectionable, a reversal that speaks to the often unpredictable and imperfect relationship between critical reception and box office success, and a reminder that audiences do not always reward quality improvements with correspondingly improved commercial returns, particularly for sequels facing the natural decline in audience enthusiasm that so often accompanies a franchise's second installment. There is a similarly interesting irony buried within the film's opening weekend performance. Dr. Dolittle 2 debuted at the box office in second place, trailing behind The Fast and the Furious, a franchise that would go on to build its entire multi-billion-dollar identity around fast cars, illegal street racing, high-speed chases, and a celebration of raw horsepower and gasoline-fueled spectacle. A gentle family film built around environmental conservation and the protection of forest habitats from destructive development opened in the shadow of a film franchise that would eventually become almost a cultural byword for exactly the kind of high consumption, high-emission automotive culture that stands in fairly direct tension with the conservation-minded themes Dr. Dolittle 2 was trying to promote to its younger audience. It is a small, almost accidental irony of box office scheduling, two utterly different value systems opening in theaters the very same weekend, competing directly for the same family audience dollars. The film's franchise trajectory following its release contains its own layer of structural irony worth examining closely. Dr. Dolittle 2 marked the final theatrical appearance of Eddie Murphy in the title role that had, quite literally, revived the entire Dolittle character for modern audiences and turned it into a bankable franchise in the first place. Despite being the actor whose star power had single-handedly resurrected a character that had languished in relative obscurity since a costly and disappointing 1967 musical adaptation decades earlier, Murphy would never return to play Dr. Dolittle again after this film. Instead, the franchise pivoted entirely away from him, continuing forward through a series of direct-to-video sequels centered not on the Doctor himself but on his daughter Maya, played by Kyla Pratt, who along with Norm Macdonald's uncredited narration as Lucky, became the only cast members to appear across the franchise's full original run. The character and the franchise that Murphy's star power had built essentially outgrew him, continuing on for years afterward in a form he was never part of again. A strange irony for a franchise so thoroughly identified in the public imagination with his specific comedic persona. That franchise irony deepens even further when placed alongside the history of the character before Murphy's involvement. The very first cinematic adaptation of Dr. Dolittle, released in 1967 and starring Rex Harrison, was an enormously expensive musical production that ultimately underperformed at the box office relative to its costs, becoming something of a cautionary Hollywood tale about lavish, big-budget family spectacle failing to connect with audiences. It took more than 30 years for the character to find genuine box office success, and it did so only once it was completely reimagined, stripped of its musical numbers and English countryside setting, and rebuilt around Eddie Murphy's distinctly American, urban comedic sensibility. A character whose first cinematic outing became synonymous with expensive failure went on to become one of the more reliably profitable family franchises of the early 2000s, before eventually returning to precisely the kind of large-scale, effects-driven spectacle that had originally sunk it, when the franchise was rebooted once more in 2020 with Robert Downey Jr., a production that, much like the 1967 original, invested heavily in ambitious visual scale and ultimately met a considerably more mixed critical and commercial reception than the leaner, more character-focused Murphy-era films that had preceded it. There is also an interesting technological irony worth considering when looking back at Dr. Dolittle 2 from a modern vantage point. At the time of its release, the film's combination of trained live animals, sophisticated animatronic puppetry, and selective digital effects work represented a genuinely impressive technical achievement, requiring an enormous, carefully coordinated production effort involving over 250 animals and dozens of specialized trainers working in careful concert with practical effects teams. This approach was, in its own way, cutting-edge filmmaking for its era. Yet within less than 2 decades, this entire filmmaking methodology would become almost completely obsolete, rendered essentially unnecessary by rapid advances in computer-generated animation and digital character work. When the Dolittle franchise was eventually rebooted in 2020, its talking animals were brought to life almost entirely through digital animation rather than the kind of elaborate practical animatronics and real animal training that had defined the earlier films. What had once been considered a state-of-the-art technical accomplishment, worthy of significant behind-the-scenes attention and marketing, became, within a relatively short span of film industry history, a filmmaking approach so thoroughly superseded by newer technology that modern productions would have little reason to attempt it again. An irony common to many technically ambitious films whose cutting-edge techniques inevitably age into historical curiosities as the underlying technology continues to evolve. The film's internal comedic framing carries its own small ironies worth noting as well. The forest animals rallying to save their home are led by a character explicitly designed and voiced as a parody of a mafia crime boss, the self-important God Beaver, complete with a raccoon henchman referred to within the film's own promotional materials as a kind of mafioso lieutenant. There is something amusingly incongruous about borrowing the visual and narrative language of organized crime, family loyalty, and turf protection, tropes traditionally associated with gritty, often violent adult crime dramas, and repurposing that entire framework to tell a gentle, G-rated story about forest conservation and habitat protection aimed squarely at young children. The gap between the genre conventions being referenced and the audience actually being addressed produces a kind of built-in tonal irony that runs throughout several of the film's animal ensemble scenes. Even the film's human family subplot contains a subtle irony worth reflecting on. Charissa's storyline throughout the film centers on the consequences of slipping grades and the resulting parental discipline of having her phone confiscated, a fairly ordinary and universally relatable teenage struggle. The actress bringing this character to life, Raven-Symoné, had by this point in her own life already achieved a level of professional accomplishment and industry recognition that most adults never reach in an entire career, having worked steadily in television and films since infancy, headlined a wildly popular sitcom throughout her childhood, and built a simultaneous recording career as one of the youngest artists ever signed to a major record label. There is a gentle irony in watching a young performer whose real life represented such an extraordinary level of achievement and professional discipline portray a fictional teenager struggling with the comparatively ordinary challenge of keeping her grades up. A reminder of just how thoroughly a skilled performer can inhabit a character whose circumstances bear little resemblance to their own considerably more extraordinary reality. Finally, one of the more quietly satisfying ironies of Dr. Dolittle 2 involves its own narrative structure, and how neatly it mirrors its underlying message without perhaps fully intending to. The film's central plea is that value and belonging should not be determined by superficial categories, that a circus-performing bear who has never lived in the wild deserves the chance to find genuine connection and purpose beyond the narrow role he was trained to play, and that a forest deemed commercially worthless by developers might in fact house something of irreplaceable value. And yet the film itself, made and marketed as fairly disposable, formulaic studio family entertainment, a sequel churned out quickly to capitalize on a previous hit, using largely familiar genre conventions and comedic formulas, went on to become something that many who watched it as children still return to decades later with genuine affection and nostalgia. A piece of disposable entertainment that, much like Archie and much like the forest itself, ended up carrying more lasting value than its origins as a quick commercial follow-up might have suggested it ever would. Taken together, these layers of irony, some poignant, some structural, some simply amusing coincidences of casting and timing, add a surprisingly rich and unexpected dimension to a film that most audiences remember simply as a light-hearted story about a talking bear looking for love. From a fictional endangered species brought to life by one of nature's genuine conservation success stories, to a cast member whose off-screen legacy would take such a dark turn, to a beloved wildlife personality whose comedic cameo would later read as an eerie premonition, Dr. Dolittle 2 turns out to be a film whose behind-the-scenes and after-the-fact realities are, in their own strange way, every bit as layered and surprising as the earnest, animal-filled story it tells on screen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the many ironic and surprising historical details surrounding Dr. Dolittle 2, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with fellow film fans, and subscribe to Review and Facts so you never miss our next detailed breakdown.